We came, we sna, we conquered, we live. Good to see y'all. Good to see y'all. Thanks so much for coming out. Oh, boy. Oh, boy. All right. Audio looks fine. I think we're going to jump right in because, well, got a good bit of ground to cover. Got some peasant work to do tonight. So let's hop right in. Awe, amici! My name is Faustus Marius Incitatus, the true consul of Rome, the favorite horse of the god Emperor Caligula. Hope you are all having a fantastic evening. Thank you so much for joining me for the very belated history stream. Horsestory. We're back. We back, baby. This one was tough. I'll just be totally real. And I'm still very nervous about doing this one. But we got a good bit of ground to cover. Yep. Just like is that a peasant? Of course. Yes. And we're going to talk about how much ground the peasants had to cover. It's a very important topic. So yeah, this one was kind of hard for me. I don't know. The holidays are always kind of tough. I think I talked about this on stream before. Yeah, it's just, it's difficult for me to do stuff during the holidays, do challenging things, so this kind of fell by the wayside for far too long. But finally here, finally doing it. Thank you so much for being here, being a part of it, or watching the VOD if you're catching it later. It means the world to me. So, with that sentiment out of the way, hope everybody had a fantastic day. Mine was very nice, just a lot of last-minute preparation on this presentation, and yeah, that was about it. God, I'm gonna be relieved when this one's over, to be honest. But, so, in case you hadn't picked it up, today we are talking about the Peasants of Languedoc, or Languedoc. It's probably the better pronunciation. It's a book by Emmanuel Le Roy Ladurie, and it really did change how history is written. Not on its own. It's sort of it's a symptom of the change. We'll put it that way. But it was a very pioneering work of history. So I'm excited to talk about this. This is the real nerdy esoteric shit. I fully expect this to be an extremely obscure stream, but I hope you can follow along. I hope you enjoy. If you have any questions, that is what the chat feature is for. That's why I do these streams live, because I love to be able to answer questions in real time. So if something comes up, you know that I love the esoteric. Absolutely. Well, it's esoteric and it's mundane at the same time. We are discussing peasants, but we are discussing high concepts in history related to peasants, so it'll be interesting. But yeah, if you have a question, if you need me to clarify something, if you want me to go into more detail about something, please do use the chat feature, because I'd love to take questions. That's the whole point of doing these streams, you know? I could just make history videos if I wanted to. Well, I would need to get a lot better at video editing first, but, I could just make videos if I wanted to, but I do these live because I love being able to interact and kind of clarify things or expand on things on the fly. So yeah, please do not be afraid of using that chat feature if you want to know more. So, with that out of the way, I think it's about time to hop right on in. Oh boy. Here we go. Alright, so the full, magnificent name of this presentation, as you can see on the screen, is A Great Agricultural Cycle, The Peasants of Languedoc and the Art of Writing History. So yeah, here we go. Look at that charming peasant family. That you can tell they really love their lives, don't you? Can't you? They're just, they're so happy to be out there working the fields every day. Doggo's pretty happy about it, too. Oh, you can't see my cursor. Never mind. Doggo in the bottom left. He's seen some stuff, man. He's seen some stuff. Probably has to do with the fact that they live in a one-room shack, so he gets to see everything. There's no escaping it. The kids, too. Blah. Anyways, we are getting far off topic. I like the cat. The cat's good, too. Yeah, the cat knows where to hang out. The cat is hanging out near the cauldron. It's picking up any scraps that might fall out. probably getting really pissed if any hot scraps fall out and land on it, but, a cat is a cat is a cat. Alright, so let's talk about this great agricultural cycle that Emmanuel Le Roy Ladurie is writing about. So, the book is called The Peasants of Languedoc. It was published in 1966 in French, of course, by Emmanuel Le Roy Ladurie, and he did it as a doctoral thesis. It was translated, you can see in the bottom there, into English, I believe, in 1974, and that's really when it kind of took the world by storm. So, the Peasants of Languedoc sought to portray the lives of the common people in the southern French province of Languedoc, and you can kind of see it highlighted on the map of France on the cover of the book. Circa 1400 to 1700, so we're kind of talking the early modern era. If you're not familiar with the if you're not familiar with the timeline, it's usually considered about mid 1400s, definitely 1500 is the early modern era. It's that it's also like it encapsulates the Renaissance. You can use that term for it as well, but historians prefer the early modern era because everybody has a Renaissance at a different time. But yeah, it's kind of the bizarre liminal space between the Middle Ages and the Industrial era. So this is a absolute obsession of French historians for some reason, and we're going to talk about that near the end of the presentation. The school that Emmanuel Le Roy Ladurie belongs to is absolutely obsessed with this time period, the early modern era in France. And that's fair, it's a very, very interesting time period. You have Louis XIV, you have the French Revolution, you've got all of that good stuff leading up to the Industrial era. So what was really groundbreaking about the Peasants of Languedoc is that Emmanuel Le Roy Ladurie brought the receipts, literally. He went around to all of the different archives in Languedoc, and he pulled up the tax receipts, the land surveys, the tithe records, the baptismal records, all of this good stuff, and because he wanted to create a work of total history. Total history is the term that he wants to use for this. So it's not a narrative, right? He's not just talking about one person. He's not just talking about, a war. He's not talking about, that sort of thing. He wants to paint a total history. He wants to paint a full picture of what life was like for these peasants in this backwater French province for this period of 300 years. So, and he does so in the most scientific fashion possible by performing statistical analysis on all of these different tax receipts, land surveys, all that good stuff, seeing who owns the land, seeing what they were planting on it, seeing how many people there were, watching as those sorts of things change over time, and really trying to paint a picture of, peasant society in this time period. So, as a student, of course, a student in France in the middle of the 20th century, he's of course very much exposed to Marxist thought, and it's actually the reason that he started the study that became the Peasants of Languedoc, because the Marxist depiction of this early modern era is pretty simplistic. They argue that it's dominated by the steady emergence, as it says, of a land-grabbing capitalist class. The Marxists argue that this was the main factor animating all of French society at this time, so on and so forth. So Ladurie wants to look into that. He wants to investigate that and see how much truth there is to that. So this is part of the reason why the land surveys are so important to him, is because he wants to look at, there's a land-grabbing capitalist class, so we should see these certain people, these urban bourgeoisie grabbing up more and more and more of the land as time goes on. So he wanted to really look into that and to analyze how much, to what extent that was true, how much the early modern French society was dominated by this emergence of a land-grabbing capitalist class. So that's what it started as, and of course, feature creep. Feature creep is definitely a thing. So it started as that. He wanted to just look into this Marxist depiction of what early modern France was like, and he ended up creating this work of total history that's let's talk about everything in the lives of these peasants. And what he ends up finding is very interesting. So let's go ahead and move forward here. But first, a word about Languedoc. The area that we're talking about, as I said, it's a large former province of France. Former because it's been broken up, like the modern administrative divisions. This is like 3 different provinces now, or departments, or whatever the hell they're called in France. God, I really should remember that. But yeah, it's a former province. It was all under the county of Toulouse. And they speak Occitan. The region's name actually comes from the term Languedoc. And what Languedoc means is the language of yes. So there was a very, around this time period, like late medieval, early modern, it's very strange. How to explain it? It kind of sounds, I want to jazz it up because it kind of sounds stupid as... And it is kind of stupid, I'll be totally honest. So, like, languages were called by what their word for yes was. So, Oc in Occitan means yes. And that's all it means. And so the name of the language, Occitan, the region where it's spoken, Languedoc, it all means yes. And there was a phrase, that's... And they used that phrase to refer to the various different languages, is how to put it, I guess. So yeah, like Occitan was the Languedoc, French was the Langue d'Oui, and, Italian was the Langue de Si. The spoke exclusively in yes lyrics, I see. Indeed, yep. A very roundabout way of saying that. Ha 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 ha. So yes. So Languedoc is very much a backwater. It's far from the center of power in Paris. All that good stuff. It's very poor. It's somewhat sparsely populated. Like, obviously, the Ile-de-France, the Midi, kind of the north and the central part of France are a bit more heavily populated. And a lot of the lack of population has to do with the climate and kind of the terrain in Languedoc. It's along the coast, obviously, very, very pleasant. It's very Mediterranean, but the further you get inland, it rapidly turns into swamps and mountains. And neither of those are particularly good for cultivating any sort of food on any sort of large scale that would actually allow you to make any money. So yes, it was a Mediterranean climate, had lots of swamps, lots of mountains inland. Major products were grain, and this is true for all of France. Everybody grew grain, and I'm going to go into a little bit of why that was and why that was kind of silly, but there was really no other choice. Everybody grew grain in France. It was the #1 crop. So even on this somewhat marginal land, they're trying to grow grain in the swamps. They're trying to grow grain in the mountains. Well, maybe not totally up in the mountains, but in the foothills. So yeah, there's a lot of marginal land. They're still trying to grow grain on it. It's the #1 product by far. They also produce a good bit of wine. And this is, as a side note, this is what Languedoc is actually good for. It's a fantastic wine growing region. But they didn't really grow that much wine there during the time period, and we're going to go into that as well a little bit, why that was and why it's kind of crazy. But yes, they did grow some wine. There were a lot of sheep herds, of course. It's Mediterranean, so of course they grew a ton of olives, and then up in the mountains there were a crap load of chestnut trees. Basically, if you couldn't grow grain up in the mountains, you survived on chestnuts. You made chestnut flour. There were some walnuts and almonds too, but chestnuts were the big thing. Chestnut is actually called the bread tree in some archaic terminology. It's called the bread tree because yeah, you can make kind of crappy flour out of it and all that good stuff. So yeah, up in the mountains, kind of the further north you went, north and east, big mountains, and they survived pretty much on chestnuts. And then you have the major towns. Toulouse was the capital, by far. Montpellier was the main port. It's kind of... The map's kind of... Montpellier's definitely on the coast. It doesn't look like it, but it's kind of right there in the center. It's on the coast. It's the main port for Languedoc. Then you have Nîmes and Béziers, which are both a little bit inland. Béziers is kind of a port. But not as important as Montpellier. So those were the major towns, major products. Just a little background of what Languedoc was like. So it was a swampy, mountainous, lightly populated area, somewhat poor, didn't really produce anything of too much value. So... And this is kind of an interesting thing, right? This is a little bit of why the Peasants of Languedoc was so groundbreaking, is because, well... It's not that nothing interesting happened here. interesting things certainly did happen here, but it's not necessarily the first place you would focus on if you were going to be studying France during this time period. Again, this is kind of the backwater, so it's very, very interesting that Ladurie chooses to look into the lives of the peasants, who again are not the people you would necessarily be studying before this. Again, you'd probably be more interested in the kings and the military figures. That's traditional history, right? So he's looking at these peasants in kind of this backwater area of France. So that's what Languedoc's all about. So let's start with our narrative. Let's start talking about this great agricultural cycle that Ladurie identifies going on during the early modern era in this backwater part of France. So it starts off at the low water mark. And anybody who knows the time period can pretty easily guess what is responsible for the low water mark of this society. Languedoc suffers particularly badly from the Black Death in the 1300s. The figure given for most of Europe, the average is about 1/3 of the population dies. In a lot of towns in Languedoc, it is over 50%. A lot of villages get entirely wiped out. And it's an apocalypse, 100%. Yeah, most of the towns, the population centers, suffer losses over 50%, and a lot of the farmland ends up getting reconquered by nature. Again, not great farmland in the first place in Languedoc, so when a disaster strikes, a lot of people, even if they don't die of the Black Plague, they get the hell out. And so, especially if the farmland they're on is pretty marginal, if it's not particularly fertile farmland, and there was a lot of that in Languedoc, they get the hell out. So a lot of the farmland, especially in the marginal areas, gets reconquered by nature. And surprisingly, this is actually kind of a blessing, because when this farmland gets taken over by the forest, then, well, you have all of the forest creatures, right? They start coming back as well. They start getting a lot closer to your population centers, and because there aren't a whole lot of people, the forests are not being overhunted. So it's kind of a blessing in disguise, right? A lot of the farmland gets reconquered by nature. A lot of the forest animals, the deer, that sort of thing, they wind up getting a lot closer to these population centers, and so you have this upsurge in hunting. And this is how a lot of people fed themselves, who, at least if they weren't dying of the plague, this is how a lot of people fed themselves during the 1300s. So there was a lot of hunting. You know, you kind of hear in the medieval era, like the forests were off limits, only the king could hunt. Yeah, not happening here. Not during a freaking apocalypse. Anybody could go into the forest, anybody could take down a deer, and a lot of people did that because the rest of society was very much in collapse. It was the low water mark of a society for sure. But the really, really important mechanic here, the important thing that happens, at least in Ladurie's view, is that land naturally concentrates in the hands of the survivors. Again, this is very intuitive, right? You have all of these people dying off. Entire families are getting wiped out. And so what usually happens is that they will will their lands to their neighbors or to their friends that they like. If their entire family is getting wiped out, it will go to the land will go to the very few people who survive this absolute apocalypse. And that means that this land, it concentrates. And this is a very, very, very important thing, because near the end of the Middle Ages, there was actually a population boom, and land was getting very, very hard to come by. It was getting subdivided. We're going to talk about that process later. So this is a very welcome thing for the people who do manage to survive the plague, because suddenly you have a lot of land that you can actually support yourself working. So again, and this is kind of the thing that Ladurie actually goes into. This is why the tax records and the cadastral maps and all of that are so important to what he's doing. We actually get the hard numbers. So Albi was one of those towns I mentioned as a major town in Languedoc. And to give you an idea of a major town in Languedoc in the late Middle Ages, 1,623 taxpayers at Albi, at this major town in Languedoc in 1343. Just 14 years later, there are only 686 left. So almost 1,000 of the taxpayers, almost 1,000 of the people who are actually productive members of society, they die off in the 14 years between the Black Death not being there and the Black Death really flaring up. But what's really interesting and what supports Ladurie's argument that there's land concentration is that the tax records show 80% of the land is still in use. It is still being planted, it is still being farmed, and it's held by the neighbors of the people who died off. And if you look at the values that are recorded in the tax records, the average property in Albie, it doubles in value and almost triples in acreage. So this is an absolute bonanza for the people who do get lucky enough to survive. The plague is an absolute bonanza. And in a lot of ways, it's the solution, the really, really fucked up solution to what's going on in the Middle Ages, this overpopulation and this famine that's going on. Well, suddenly there are hardly any mouths to feed. Everybody, well, not everybody, but most people are inheriting a large farm that they can easily supply themselves with, and maybe grow a little bit of extra for other people. And so it's kind of a nice thing that's happening here, and eventually it really begins to take off. So after the apocalypse, you look at the demographics in Languedoc, they actually stay depressed throughout the 1400s. You don't have the immediate boom that you might expect. Demographics stay far below their medieval highs throughout the 15th century. And then a lot of very natural things happen. Farm labor is very scarce, obviously. All labor is very scarce because a whole bunch of people are dead. So naturally, wages are very high. And again, Ladurie looks into this by examining the tax records, examining the tithes, looking at contracts that are drawn up for agricultural workers, really goes into detail about the typical wages that a worker might receive for working on a farm. And he finds that, like most of history, most of the wages for farm workers are in kind. That means they're not paid with money, or they're not paid with a whole lot of money, but they get to keep a lot of the food. They are fed, they are provided with housing, that sort of thing. And so he looks at what kind of in-kind wages these farm workers are receiving, and they're actually kind of fantastic. So, as you might expect, again, labor's very scarce, so wages are very high, and they're very high quality. So Ladurie does this really interesting comparison about these farm workers in the 15th century when the labor is very scarce, and he compares them to farm workers in the centuries after, and they're both getting about the same amount of food, which is not the interesting part. The interesting part is the quality of the food they are receiving. The farm workers in the 15th century, they got good wine. They got 2 liters of wine per day, which is kind of hard to imagine, but the wine was not particularly alcoholic in this time period, and especially not in Languedoc. We're going to talk about why. But yeah, the wine is not particularly alcoholic, so they drink 2 liters of it per day, and they also receive wheat. They receive white flour to make the best kind of bread, and this is very common. Most of their wages are in really fine white flour wheat, and this nice high quality wine. And that's what the farm workers are receiving in the 15th century. Later on, as labor becomes a lot more plentiful, you get the same amount. You get the same number of pounds of food, but the quality goes way the hell down. They start mixing in barley they start mixing in barley with the wheat, and so you get the black bread, right? And the black bread is it's tough, it's not as nutritious, it's harder to digest, so on and so. Actually, it might be more nutritious. I think I forget, but it's harder to digest. It's not as desirable, and so you don't get as good of bread, and you get a thing called piquette, which is sour wine. And that sounds awful. That sounds awful to me. I've not tried it myself, but it sounds to me a little bit like drinking vinegar. And that was most of the wine ration that later workers received. So the wages for a farm worker after the apocalypse, after the Black Death, they're very good. They receive not necessarily more but they receive higher quality. And that makes very, very good sense because, again, we talked about all of the land as being cleared out, right? Or all of the land as being reclaimed by nature, the marginal land, the land where you grow shitty grain and bad grapes, and that's all getting reclaimed by nature. So the only land that is continuing to be tilled is the stuff that produces the really, really high quality stuff. So you can afford, again, because labor is so scarce, to give your workers the best. So wages go through the roof. Farm labor is super scarce. And that means that if you are someone who owns land, you're going to have a hell of a time making money off of it by just renting it out, right? Because again, there is a huge excess amount of land. There's so much land that the forest is retaking a lot of the marginal stuff, right? And again, hiring people to work your land is not going to be particularly profitable because wages are so damn high. So that means that the people who own the land are only going to make money off of the land if they're willing to work it themselves. So that doesn't really sound like a capitalist class, right? Getting back to what Ladurie was trying to determine in the first place. Doesn't really sound like fit conditions for a capitalist class. There is land aggregation, right? People are building up these huge estates, but they're not capitalists. They are generally people who are working the land themselves. They're not living in some city. They're not an urban bourgeoisie owning land out in the countryside. They are generally people who are working the land themselves because that is the only way to make profit, is actually farming the land yourself, maybe hiring a few people at those insane wages when you need help with the harvest. One of the other really, really interesting things that happens in Languedoc in particular is that the old family structure 100% breaks down. So you have this traditional, head of the father of the family, that sort of thing. His will is law, so on and so forth. You have a nuclear family, you have a household, that sort of thing that's existed in the Mediterranean for thousands and thousands of years. That breaks down, in part because so many people are dead, so many families are broken up, shattered, that sort of thing. And so the very, very interesting thing you see is that neighbors start to form fraternities. And fraternity is basically a civil union. They basically get married, but with none of the romance. It is a purely legal union between, and it can be between more than two people. In a lot of cases, it was very, very large households, 10 or more people all coming together, pooling their resources, and in a lot of cases that was necessary because, hey, we all just inherited a crap load of land, we all kind of have to cooperate if we're going to farm all of this, if we're going to profit off of this. So one of the really interesting things that happens during this time is that the family structure breaks down, and you see these legal creations, these fraternities pop up. And again, nothing to do with love. You obviously, like, it's a business partnership, obviously. Like, you have to trust the other people you're in the fraternity with, obviously. But yeah, it's not about family, it's not about love, it's about, oh my god, I've inherited all of this land. If I don't have help from my friends, there's no way in hell I'm going to be able to plant it all. So, these people, maybe they didn't inherit any land. Maybe they just have their tiny little plot that they've farmed since forever. So let's enter a fraternity. I have the land, they have the labor. So let's pool our resources. They work my land. I share part of the profits from the land that I've inherited from my dead neighbor, and it kind of just goes like that. So this is a very, very, very interesting thing that happens, and once you get into the 1500s, it immediately disappears. Well, not immediately. It dies out very, very quickly. It's fascinating stuff. But yeah, once you get into the 1500s, once the family kind of reasserts itself a little bit, goes away. This goes away. So this is one of the really more fascinating things, and I wish I had the time to go more in depth into this, but God, we're running long already. So anyways, so yeah, fraternities are something that become a very, very big thing as a response to, well, the apocalypse. Pretty much, people band together and they do what they can to look out for one another. All right. And then we get to Mr. Gentleman Farmer. So I kind of hinted at this, before, but the only people who are making profits during this time period are the people who are willing to work the land themselves. So if you own the land, if you're willing to work it yourself, you are making all of the profits because, again, not a lot of people working, not a lot of people producing food, so you're selling stuff at a great, great, great profit. You've probably gained some land from your dead neighbors who died of the plague. You can suddenly live a very, very comfortable existence, and this becomes the case for a lot of the peasants in Languedoc. So yeah, high wages, low rent, strongly incentivize landowners to work the land themselves. The property consolidation that occurs, the beneficiaries of it are not the urban capitalists, they're not even nobles, but they are the neighboring peasants who just happen to inherit land from their neighbors who died of the plague. And Ladurie proves this. He doesn't just make this assertion, he goes in once again and examines the books of the tithe, which was a royal tax that was placed on land ownership, placed on the peasants, and it keeps a record of who owns all the land. Obviously, you got to know that. If you're going to collect a land tax, you got to know who owns the land. And Ladurie goes through and he looks and he finds these names. Like before the plague, he sees how much land they own. If they survive the plague, then he checks out, okay, how much land do they own now? There are cadastral maps. Was there a land plot next to them owned by someone else who's not showing up on this tax roll now that they now own? Well, they probably died of the plague, right? They probably died of the plague and left their property to their neighbors. So these are the people generally who are benefiting from the apocalypse, who are benefiting from 50% of the population dying off of the plague. It's not urban capitalists, it's not nobles, it's neighboring peasants who are lucky enough to survive and lucky enough to inherit things from their family members or from their neighbors. And Ladurie goes through, he looks at the tax books, and he proves this very definitively, that these are the people generally who are benefiting. So late 15th century, probably about 1470s when things kind of turn around, and the plague stops being like a big deal. Late 15th century becomes the golden age of that gentleman farmer, nobleman Swerve. He makes a comfortable living working with his own lands. Again, might hire a few people, might hire a few poor laborers, just at harvest time, because again, wages are so freaking high. So that is pretty much the only person who is making money during this time period of recovering from the plague. But that doesn't last forever. And eventually, as you might expect, you have a boom. There's a bust, and then you have the boom. So starting around 1480, the population numbers absolutely start exploding all around Languedoc, and they continue growing rapidly for almost a century. 1480 to 1570 is the time period, and Ladurie, again, looks at those tax records, and one of the other things that the tax records have, obviously, well, it's a list of all of the taxpayers. Again, something that you would need to have if you're collecting taxes. And so he looks at that and he charts the population growth. And France didn't conduct a census during this time period. This is kind of the only way to really figure out the population, and it's something that people hadn't really done before, hadn't thought to do, hadn't thought to look into, tracking the population this way. So he looks at the tax records, he does statistical analysis, because that's what Ladurie is all about, and he calculates that during this time period, 1480 to 1570, the population is growing at 11.5% every 10 years. So 2 or 3 generations, the population would double. And actually, it's even more aggressive in neighboring provinces, like Provence, which is to the east, kind of on the Italian border. The population triples there from 1470 to 1540, and they have very, very good records of that. So yeah, everywhere, now that the plague is sort of over, the population starts booming because you have all of these gentlemen farmers, you have these people with large tracts of land, you have these people who are secure. They're producing a lot of food. There's good wages, even if you don't own any land. The wages are still really, really, really high. You're getting the absolute finest food for your in-kind wages, and so steady food supply, security, good wages, absolutely you're going to have explosive population growth, and that's exactly what we see throughout the 16th century in Languedoc. So at least doubles. The population at least doubles during this time period, and it probably is closer to tripling, just like Provence. So another big reason for the explosion in population growth is that the bubonic plague also kind of decreases in frequency. And this is something that's not really talked about so much. A lot of people just look at the plague like an event that happened, right? So 1300s, it sweeps through Europe, it kills a lot of people, so on and so forth, but it doesn't go away. It becomes endemic. Every few years there is a plague outbreak, and this continues all the way through the 1400s into the 1500s. It isn't until about 1560 that we see the last real bubonic plague outbreak in Languedoc. But what keeps happening, as viruses normally do, they start to decrease in virulence. They start to decrease in frequency. People build up immunities to them, and just the natural process of, the really deadly viruses, they kill all of the people who they infect. So that's not necessarily the best thing for a virus that wants to reproduce, that wants to spread to as many hosts as possible. You don't want to kill your hosts, right? So naturally, pretty much all viruses over time, they become less virulent, they become less deadly, and this is exactly what happens to the bubonic plague. So around 1510, the outbreaks become rare, and by 1560, they're done. And so this is another huge part of the population growth, is that you stop having these bubonic plague outbreaks every few years, and people stop dying from them. The people who catch the bubonic plague have a better chance of surviving because, again, it's not as deadly of a strain. And so you have an absolute boom. Population at least doubles, probably closer to triples. And then suddenly, well, you have a different set of problems, right? Before, you didn't have enough people. Now you're kind of approaching the point where there's too much. So you have to deal with it somehow. So more mouths to feed becomes the problem near the end of the 16th century. The peasants cope with the rising population by reclaiming those abandoned farmlands that the forests had previously taken over. Peasants start clear-cutting those forests again. They start reclaiming those abandoned farmlands. And again, most of those were not particularly good farmlands, but it's better than starving. You have more mouths to feed. You need to plant as much grain as possible. There's also, and this is a very interesting thing that Ladurie records, there's also an extensive arboring of the fields, which means planting olive and nut trees in between the rows of grain. And so in the 15th century and the late 1400s there, olive trees are very uncommon in Languedoc. But by the mid-1500s, by that date of about 1560, 1/3 of all farmland in Languedoc has some sort of tree on it, and it's probably olives. So Ladurie proves this by looking at the tithe records, and the tithe was the tax paid to the church, obviously. Like, you're supposed to give 10% of your even today, you're told, the religious people, right? They're supposed to give 10% of their wages to the church. That's the ideal. That's what you should be doing. Back in this time period, it wasn't so much a suggestion as the law. You give 10% of your production to the church. You give 10% of your production to the church, or you suffer the consequences. But that means that it's very easy to figure out exactly how much is being produced, right, in a given area. So you look at the tithe records, you look at how much they got, and you multiply that by 10, and you have a really good idea of the total amount that is being produced in a given area. So it's kind of a very neat thing that Ladurie does. But one of the things he notices from 1500 to 1560, he notices this huge upsurge in the amount of olive oil that is being donated to the church. And so that's kind of the proof that people are kind of going nuts with the olive trees. They're planting them frickin' everywhere. And of course, the tax records also record what's being planted on a certain farmland. And, well, yeah, very rare. on to see olive trees showing up on the tax records before 1500. By the mid 1500s, 1/3 of all farmland showing up in the tax records mentions olives. So this is a so there's basically two ways, right, that they're coping with this upsurge in population. They're reclaiming farmland, they're planting it with grain, and they're also planting additional stuff on the farmland that does exist. The olive oil production goes through the roof, but really interestingly, and you wouldn't expect this, during this time period, wine production doesn't expand very much. And it's the strangest thing. And this is kind of a very interesting thing. And this kind of goes against the Marxist narrative in a way, because if you were having an emerging capitalist class, you really would expect wine production to be something that boomed. You would generally just expect wine production to be something that boomed here. Again, modern Languedoc is all about growing wine. Or growing grapes and making wine. That is its main product now. But back in this time period, it really wasn't that much of an important product. Like, sure, a lot of it did get made. Like, they had to provide that 2 liters of wine per day to every peasant. So a lot of it is getting made. But there's a technology issue and there's a culture issue. They don't produce wine at any sort of an industrial scale, obviously, but the really interesting thing is they also don't produce wine the right way, or the most optimal way at least. For some reason, and this was not the case in all of Europe, but in Languedoc in particular, for some reason, and no one is quite sure why, there was a cultural expectation that you harvest the grapes as soon as they are ripe. As soon as they are ripe, you harvest those grapes. And that's a terrible idea if you're making grapes into wine, because the longer a grape is allowed to ripen on the vine, the greater the sugar content. That means the stronger the wine is going to be, and also the longer the wine is going to keep. So pretty much all of the wine in Languedoc is made from these just barely ripe grapes. And that means that 1, it doesn't have a whole lot of alcohol content, and 2, it does not keep. Forget about keeping a barrel of wine in your cellar for 20 years and letting it age to perfection. This stuff turns into vinegar after about a year. And no one is quite sure why that was the case. No one is quite sure why it really seems like nobody in this backwater part of France realized that, hey, if we let the grapes ripen on the vine for a few more weeks, or a couple months after they're ready, it's going to make higher quality wine that, hey, we can export. People are going to actually be interested in drinking this because it's tasty, and it's going to keep for longer. It's not going to turn into vinegar after a year. Nobody figures this out. And it's the damnedest thing. There's no explanation for it. But it kind of goes to show you that the troubles that these peasants were facing, it wasn't all just economic, It wasn't just the king keeping them down. It wasn't just the fact that they're forced to work these marginal farmlands and that sort of thing. There was a real technological and cultural disadvantage that made the appearance of this capitalist class, that made the appearance of this capitalist society kind of impossible. So this was a big thing. This was a very interesting thing. So wine production, despite what you would expect, it does not expand much during this population boom. It's entirely due to cultural and technological reasons. Again, other people in Europe figured this out. Like the Italians were making absolutely bomb-ass wine during this time period. They knew in most of Italy that you need to let the grapes ripen on the vine. Languedoc, for whatever reason, does not figure it out in this time period. And for whatever reason, nobody ever tells them. And it's the strangest freaking thing. But yeah, wine production does not expand much. But, and again, talking about the land, and this is kind of Ladurie's most important thing, that's why I'm always underlining it, the process of land subdivision begins once again. So you had during the plague all of these people dying off, all of these people leaving their lands to their neighbors or to their family members. You had these people building up these huge chunks of land. Suddenly you have the process of land subdivision beginning again because, okay, you have the head of the household, you have this man who controls a whole lot of farms, you're having a population boom. He's probably having a whole bunch of children, and when he dies, all of those male children, at least, they get a slice of the pie. And so the process of land subdivision begins once again, and the gentleman farmer, it's kind of harder to do now because you have half as much land as your father did. So that means half as much potential for profit. And it just continues on and on. Each generation is on progressively smaller tracts of land. And so once you get into the 16th century, this process begins, and it starts to turn people into paupers. Their father was a very, very prosperous farmer, but they only get maybe a third or a quarter of the land that he owned, and that's not enough to really feed your family. It's not really enough to create enough agricultural goods that you can turn a profit and live prosperously. So once again, you see this process of land subdivision beginning. It was a brief moment. It was a glorious moment, the age of the gentleman farmer, but it ends within a few generations. And by the end of the 1500s, we're once again seeing peasants being forced onto these tiny, tiny, tiny little tracts of land that there is no way in hell they can support themselves on. And so, as you might expect, this leads to stagnation. So around 1570, Languedoc's explosive growth abruptly stagnates. And I mean that in both the population sense and the economic sense. People stop having children. In part, this is because the wars of religion kick off, because Protestantism comes to France and everybody hates that. And a lot of people start killing each other. But again, this is not really what Ladurie is going into in his book. He's not really talking about the wars, except their effect on the economy, on the population. And as the wars of religion kick off, you get famines, you get people dying in the war, you get massacres, all that nasty stuff. Population growth approaches zero. It stagnates. It stays around maybe 1 or 2% per decade, which is not a whole lot. Not a whole lot at all. And economically, they also stagnate. Again, you would expect this. You would expect this because, again, you're looking at the people who are being forced. This land subdivision is occurring, right? These people are being forced onto smaller and smaller tracts of land that they're inheriting from their fathers. You know, they're getting a tiny fraction of the land their father owned because their father probably had 10 kids, maybe 6 or 7 of them were boys, and so you're getting a tiny, 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 tiny slice of what your father was able to work. So naturally, you start to see the gross agricultural products stagnate around this time. Again, you have wars going on. That's always going to kill economic production, but you also have this process of land subdivision where there's really no profit. People aren't really exporting things to market anymore, right? They're just working the tiny tracts of land they have and trying to scrape by. So Ladurie, again, looks at the tithe. And he looks at the tithe records, and they're always talking about exactly how much they got because the monks or the priest or whatever the church is in the particular area, they're not going around, they're not collecting the taxes themselves. They're usually farming out the tithe to a professional tax collector. And so the tax collector goes out, he estimates the value of everything produced in this area controlled by the church, and he gives them an estimate, takes his cut. And so Ladurie looks at that and he sees like the estimated size of the gross product in these areas, it stops growing after 1570. It boomed for almost 100 years, but 1570, start of the wars of religion, the start of the stagnation, everything stops. So you start to see this process. The compoi, which are the books of the tithe, they're the tax records, basically, they become polarized. There used to be a middle class, right? There used to be the gentleman farmer who had a decently large estate. He wasn't like a huge landowner or anything. It was large enough for him to work and for him to make a profit off of, and that was about it. He was the gentleman farmer, the yeoman farmer, whatever you want to call him. He disappears. Naturally, right? Because the land is being subdivided, and that means there are going to be winners and there's going to be losers. So landowners start to own either large estates or tiny little patches of land. It becomes polarized between the haves and the have-nots. You see this occurring, and it plays out just plain as day in the tax records, because again, the tax records have to they have to establish the size and the value of your land holdings if they're going to tax you. So it's very, very easy to figure out and to see the change that's occurring over time. So yeah. The landowners become the haves and the have-nots. You either have a gigantic estate, you either have Versailles or you have a tiny little patch of land that you can barely support yourself on, much less a family. At the same time, wages start to stagnate. Again, those wages were very, very high because of the Black Death, because labor was in shortage. Then you have a population boom, right? You have this population boom. You have a lot more people competing for the same amount of jobs. You're reclaiming some land. You're creating some jobs. There's a little bit of economic dynamism. But again, this stagnates around 1570. So there's suddenly a glut of labor. So wages stagnate and then they begin to retreat in real terms. And what I mean by in real terms is that during the 1500s, there's also massive inflation going on. It's called the Price Revolution, and Ladurie doesn't really talk about it too much, but it had in large part to do with the fact that suddenly in the New World, the Spanish discover a whole crapload of silver and gold mines in South America and Mexico, and they start importing all of that into Europe, which was previously starved for precious metals. So, yeah, the 1500s is kind of when the price revolution occurs. There's insane inflation. But, because a lot of wages are in kind, it's pretty easy to tell, like, what people are getting paid. Because grain is grain is grain, right? So wages stagnate for the farm workers. They're paid, if not less grain, it's what I talked about, right? The wages become less high quality. You get the piquette, you get the sour wine more than the good wine. You get the barley instead of just pure wheat for your flour, that sort of thing. You get far less meat. Meat is another big thing that absolutely goes away. As always, I mean, shit, you see that nowadays, You hit a recession. Look at the grocery store now. Meat is really, really, really freaking expensive. So you hit a recession and meat is usually one of the first things that gets cut down or cut out of a family's budget. And that was absolutely the case during these times as well. So, yeah. These workers who are paid in kind, they receive far less meat, they receive crappier flour, they receive nasty sour wine, and they are generally, if they receive money, they're generally paid the same, or their money wages do not keep up with the rapid inflation that's occurring during this time period. So wages stagnate and then they retreat in real terms. So the farm worker during this time period is not paid nearly as well as the farm worker 100 years ago. And, well, this creates fertile ground for another delightful member of society who tends to pop up when times are hard. The loan shark. The loan shark, this is, well, he feasts. The loan shark freaking feasts during this time period. Because again, you have all of these small farmers who are being forced onto tiny patches of land. And that means that they generally need to borrow money. And it's absolutely predatory. It's just tremendous scum. Ladurie tells, I can't really go into it too much, but he actually tells the kind of the life story of a moneylender named Maxence. And, sorry. And he, this guy's a bastard. He's an absolute bastard. So his favorite trick was to, okay, I will lend you this much money, Mr. Farmer, because, times are pretty good right now. Times are hard right now. So the price of grain, we're going to tie this money to the price of grain, right? So I'll lend you this much money. This much money is worth, say, 4 bushels of grain now. So you're going to have to pay me back eventually. So what Maxence would do is he would wait until grain prices were depressed. He would wait until the good times, right? And he would come knocking and he would say, hey, you still owe me all of that grain. Or actually, I mixed it up. Backwards. It's so Maxence wins. He demanded the grain when the grain was the most expensive. And he would wait for it, There was no set time period, these contracts. He would just wait for grain to be its most expensive, and then he would go up and he would demand payment from these people he lent money to. Maybe I loaned you it was the other way around. Maybe I loaned you 1 bushel of grain worth of money a few years ago. Well, hey, now that money is worth 4 bushels of grain, so you better cough up 4 bushels of grain, buddy. And so, yeah, predatory moneylenders, they appear, and it's just really, 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 really messed up, really messed up. So yeah, so that's another thing, kind of adding to the misery of the agricultural worker, is the fact that they're all really freaking in debt to these loan sharks who are absolutely brutal. Tyr from Reciteer ain't got nothing on Maxence. Of course, of course, of course. When times are hard, in any pre-industrial society, the women are usually hit pretty hard by it as well, and that was 100% the case in Languedoc as well. Ladurie talks about the role of women a lot in Languedoc, and Hardsea, makes sense. Oh, Reciteer, yeah. I okay, not to get off on too much of a tangent, but I'm not sure if it's... Everybody calls it Reciteer. There was that line where Tyr says, pronounces it Reciteer, but I'm kind of wondering if, like, she's talking about, like, a mispronunciation, right? Like, anybody misreads the sign, Reciteer or Racketeer. So I'm kind of wondering if, it is Reciteer, and she was just wondering what happens if someone thinks it's a hard C. I don't know. I don't know. But anyways, getting off on a tangent. So yeah. So women suffer particularly hard during this wage stagnation because, despite what a lot of people might think, and despite what you might have been told, women actually in peasant society, they did a lot of work. And this was kind of... Peasant society actually had, some manner of sexual equality, really. And it makes sense, right? Because if you're doing backbreaking manual labor, there is absolutely no reason. You'd be insane if you just let your wife stay in the house all day, right? If you just let her be a homekeeper and, just sit and eat bonbons and paint her fingernails. No, that's something the noble ladies did, right? If you're a peasant, you need all available hands, and women absolutely worked if they were peasants. And the really messed up thing is they typically worked for far less than a male wage worker might earn. So again, Ladurie is able to track this and does so brilliantly. So women are basically always paid less than men for the entire time period, since time immemorial. So in the Middle Ages, unskilled female farm laborers, they got roughly half of a male's wage. When the Black Death rolls around, when labor becomes very, very scarce, as you might expect, causes this to trend upwards. Women are making as high as 80% of a male wage when labor is very scarce. But by 1600... by this wage stagnation, this figure drops to about 37% of what a male might make. And this is in all industries. It's not just farm laborers. It's the same for wet nurses and maids. Obviously, there's no male equivalent for a wet nurse, but there's these wet nurses and maids in the town. They experience a similar wage stagnation, and so. As you might not be surprised, this means that prostitution becomes really, really common during this time period. There's a very, very famous, well, not a very, very famous, but there's a famous phrase in Avignon, which is in the next province over, that on the Great Bridge of Avignon, is there? Oh God, please no. I'm assuming that's for the male wet nurses. Please no. So yeah, there's a very famous phrase in Avignon, which is the next province to the east, that on the Great Bridge of Avignon you will always meet 2 donkeys, 2 monks, and 2 whores, because it was a very, very, it was dominated by the church, and there were a crap load of prostitutes, and you gotta wonder if the 2 things were related. But yeah, so anecdotal evidence from this time. There's a lot of old fogies bemoaning the collapse of society and morals during this time, because there are prostitutes everywhere, and you can't really blame them, to be quite honest. So yeah, kind of the funny thing is, like, the big landowners, they hired women. They hired women as much as possible and took advantage of this, That's like the thing about the pay gap nowadays, not to get political about it, but like, if businesses could really get away with paying women a whole lot less for the same work, wouldn't women be the only people working? You would think so. And that was definitely the case here. Like, women were absolutely preferred as farm laborers because you didn't have to pay them very much. Maybe they weren't as strong as a man. Maybe they couldn't do all of the same work. But, God, 37% of the wage of a male farm worker, that's hard to argue against. So yeah, women are hit extremely hard. Peasant women had always been working. This was the case, again, from time immemorial. If you're on a farm, everybody works. The women, the men, the children, everyone works. If you're a wage worker, if you're just scraping by, the woman is actually absolutely going to work to contribute to the household. And unfortunately, during this time period, wages absolutely stagnate. And it hits the women the hardest, is what Ladurie's data suggests. So, how do you deal with this? The first part of the Peasants of Languedoc is kind of talking about these economic processes that are occurring. The second part goes into, beyond the economics, how did people deal with this? Well, there was a boom and then there was a bust, and there were some challenging times. So how did people deal with the challenging times? And, well, as you might expect, for any pre-modern society, the answer, a lot of the time, was spirituality. So during this time period, Calvinism takes root in Languedoc. Protestantism takes root in Languedoc. These are the Huguenots. And it's very, very popular in the craftsmen. The craftsmen of the towns in the Cevennes, which is the mountainous region kind of in the northeastern part of Languedoc, they're extremely receptive. And it's really, really interesting. Most of the agricultural peasants stay Catholic. And Ladurie kind of talks a little bit about why this is, and has his own theory, and it's a pretty convincing one. So, like, Calvinism stresses hard work. That's like one of the biggest facets of Calvinism is the idea that if you work hard, you can have wealth, you can have all of these things. You can earn your way into heaven. Basically, is and I'm way oversimplifying that, but there was a very, very strong emphasis on hard work in Calvinism, and so it's not terribly surprising that the craftsmen are the ones who are the most receptive to that. And why do you think that is? I think, and Ladurie argues this as well, I think it's because if you're a craftsman, there is actually an incentive for hard work. Not to say that agricultural work isn't hard, but you see a real incentive for hard work. If you're willing to stay the extra hours, like the stereotypical Calvinist during this time was a wool carder. It was someone who made cloth out of wool. If you're willing to stay at that spinning wheel for, from sun up to sundown, you're going to produce more wool than someone who only works a few hours a day, and you're going to be able to sell it for more. You're going to become more prosperous. Meanwhile, the agricultural peasants, they're confined to a certain patch of land, and there's not a whole lot they can do to make the crops grow faster, right? You can plant, you can take care of the crops, you can harvest them when the time comes, but really a lot of it is up to the weather, a lot of it is up to natural processes. So there's not necessarily as much of a focus on hard work. Again, cannot stress enough, this does not mean that agricultural work was not backbreakingly difficult, backbreakingly hard, just that the craftsmen saw more immediate rewards for hard work. They saw more of a reason for hard work, if that makes sense. And so naturally they would think of that as a virtue. They would be more receptive to these spiritualities that talk about the virtues of hard work. So the craftsmen in the towns are super receptive to Calvinism, and also in the Cevennes. Because this is a mountainous area, it's somewhere where agriculture is really difficult. So a lot of people, they make their money that way. There are a lot more craftsmen up in the mountains than there are on the fertile plains because, well, you can run a farm down there, but you can't run a farm in the mountains, so you have to find some other way to support yourself. And in a lot of cases, that means becoming a smith or becoming a wool carder or becoming something like that, becoming a craftsman. So Calvinism takes root big time in Languedoc. It becomes a Huguenot stronghold. The other response, and especially this occurs once after the Edict of Nantes is revoked, after the Huguenots are banished, they're forced to convert or leave France, people turn to witchcraft instead. And witchcraft becomes super, super, super common in Languedoc, especially in Montpellier, also up in the mountains or the other remote areas where, there's not necessarily a priest going out that often and checking people out, seeing that they're not worshiping Satan. So witchcraft becomes extremely common. And again, both of these spiritualities, Calvinism and witchcraft, they're very, very much rooted in this idea of, society is unfair, so we're going to take refuge in spirituality instead. They have very different approaches to it. Calvinism stretches hard work. Witchcraft stresses deals with the devil, but they're both kind of about escaping this crushing economic process that's kind of squeezing the life out of everyone at this time. So this is when you start to see the emergence of this capitalist class that Ladurie was trying to research, and it happens in the damnedest way. So there's Huguenot sentiment, right? There are these Protestants suddenly, and naturally, they're not too keen on paying the tithe. They're not too keen on supporting these Catholic monasteries and abbeys and cathedrals and all of this stuff. They're not too keen on that. So there's a huge upswelling in anti-church sentiment as Calvinism really begins to take root, and a very, very conniving member of the bourgeoisie, a very, very rich man by the name of Claude Terlon. He goes before the Estates of Languedoc, and he begins advocating for seizing the church's lands, because we're good Huguenots now. People shouldn't be forced to support this religion that they don't even believe in, right? Very high-minded, very, very spiritual, but really what was going on is that Claude Terlon was a fantastically rich man, and he wanted an excuse to get his hands on those juicy tracts of land held by the church, and in 1563 it begins. It starts, it happens. The church is forced to sell off a lot of their extraneous land, and it goes to just a few rich buyers. Again, Ladurie has the receipts for this. He examines, there's bills of sale, there's a record of who all of the land that the church sold off went to, and it's usually just a few rich, often urban bourgeoisie buyers. So this spirituality, kind of unintended, it's the birth of the capitalist class, really. Because suddenly you have these urbanites who control just these fat stacks of land. Wages are depressed. It's easy to staff this land and to make a profit by not necessarily working it yourself, by just collecting rent. So yeah, it's kind of funny, but spirituality kind of leads to the emergence of the capitalist class, and Claude Terlon is a big figure in that. And then we get to tax evasion for peasants. So the Huguenot leaders, the bourgeoisie, the nobles who are persuaded over to Protestantism, naturally they don't want to pay the tithe to the Catholic Church. They think that the tithe should instead be paid to themselves. Obviously, makes sense. We are the enlightened people leading this revolution against the Catholic Church. We are the new spiritual leaders, so naturally, the tithe should be going to us, the elect. The peasants are having none of that, as you do. So Ladurie proves this, again, by examining the tax records, the tithe records, and he found that starting in the late 16th century, tax evasion becomes the national pastime, and especially in Languedoc, it becomes just an art form. 100%. Avoiding the tithe, avoiding paying taxes is just Mwah. Beautiful, beautiful. Just some of the things people get up to. So peasants do whatever the hell they can to avoid the tithe. Um, they fake illnesses. They act based peasants. Yeah, 100%. Why did you kill President Kimball? Because he tried to make me pay taxes. Understandable. Yeah. So yeah, the based peasants, they turn tax evasion into a fine art. And Ladurie proves this. He checks out the tithe records. He establishes that, okay, like there's not really a decline in the gross agricultural product. We're still producing the same amount of stuff for the most part. There's fluctuations, obviously, but we're generally producing about the same amount of stuff, but we're paying so much less to the tithes. We're paying so much less in tithes. So the peasants, they keep it to themselves. They're not paying the Catholic Church. They're sure as hell not paying these Huguenot leaders who are appointing themselves as the new moral authority. They're just going to keep it for themselves. And that makes a lot of sense because, again, we have all of these forces working against the peasants, right? We have wages going down. We have the average land holding is shrinking. So it's a pretty natural response. Some people did it, I'm sure, because of their conscience, because they didn't want to support a church they didn't believe in. Once those people got away with it, everybody kind of got in on the act. So the tithe suddenly falls by the wayside. And ironically, this forces the church, as you might expect, to sell off even more land to the bourgeoisie. They sell off even more land because, well, they're not bringing in the tithe anymore. Or they're not bringing in nearly as much, so they can't afford to keep things running. They have to sell off even more land. So this vicious cycle occurs, and the spirituality becomes kind of one of the main engines that creates this urban capitalist class. So kind of unexpected, but once you saw the gears in motion, of course, yeah, people are going to start evading the tithe, and that's going to force the church to sell off even more. And, as this goes on, as things become even more desperate, anti-tax revolts become very, very common. Late 1500s, early 1600s, happens all the damn time. And there are also just violent backlashes against the rich and powerful. There are these, again, kind of based peasants who, just decide, okay, we're gonna go out and kill us some rich guys. And that happens. It becomes kind of common, and it's usually met with a far more than proportional response. Like almost every case, the peasants who are responsible and all of the peasants around them get massacred in response. But this becomes very, very common in the late 1500s, early 1600s in Languedoc, and I can't really talk about it too much or go into it, but at least not this time. I'd love to study it more, but Ladurie writes this amazing narrative about a thing called the Carnival of Roman, which was it's a festival, basically. It's kind of a costume party, and it turns into one of these violent backlashes against the rich and powerful, and it just is like it's something out of a book. It's stranger than fiction. So basically you have this costume party, right? And all of the rich people show up, and they're wearing all of their finery, these whimsical costumes, and the peasants show up, and something sets them off. And so it just turns into this riot that continues for several days. And you have these people who continue to wear their costumes, right? They kind of like take on a life of their own and sort of become these two opposing fantasy armies, essentially. It's really, really, really fucking bizarre, but it's all kind of traced back to this violent backlash against the rich. The peasants, it wasn't a real revolution. Like, they didn't have set political goals. It's the joke. Yeah, it's the Joker in the 16th century. Pretty much, man. Yeah, like, what do you get when you take a peasant and and make fun of him and take his land and steal his wages? You get what you effing deserve. So yeah, it's just this bizarre. The Carnival of Roman. I suggest looking it up. It's because it just turns into this And of course, at the end, all of the peasants get murdered. Like the the rich people decide they've had enough. That this is actually getting dangerous. One of us might actually die. Well, we better wipe them all out. So unfortunately, it does not end like the Joker. It ends with just all of the peasants getting wiped out. But this becomes very common. This is just one of the episodes. There is strong resentment against the rich and powerful. It doesn't really take the form of the revolution. Like, these are not proto-communists or anything. They're just angry. They're just angry, and it takes this form. Violent backlashes, these random... A lot of times it takes the form of an anti-tax revolt. They believe that paying less taxes is going to fix society. And, you know, in a sense, maybe it'll help out a little bit. But yeah, there's no actual revolutionary rhetoric or anything like that. You know, these are not proto-communists or anything. They're just angry peasants. And the peasants were very, very angry at this time. So, things, unfortunately, only get worse. So as the 17th century dawns, land rent in Languedoc finally begins to take off, as you might imagine. Because, once again, we have a large population now competing for limited jobs on very limited land. You can pay them practically nothing. They're willing to accept very, very low wages. So finally, these big landowners, they finally have all the leverage. And that means that they can charge whatever the hell they want for rent. And boy, you know they do that. So the tenant farmer, who was the big winner in the previous century, during the boom times, this gentleman farmer, he suddenly becomes the loser. He suddenly gets crushed underneath what Ladurie terms the rent offensive, in which rents are jacked through the roof. And this means that it's finally profitable, again, to hold land and to rent it out to other people. And that means that you finally see, as I mentioned before, this urban landowning capitalist class begins to emerge. In Toulouse, in Nîmes, in Montpellier, you have this small cadre of people who, you know, maybe they're shopkeepers, maybe they're minor nobles, but they have a bunch of money. They're able to just buy up land and rent it out to people and make a huge profit doing that. You don't have to work, you just be a landlord. So this is kind of the birth of this urban capitalist class that the Marxists had supposed had been in effect all throughout the modern era, or the early modern era, excuse me. This is when it actually emerges, not until the 1600s, not until this whole process of land consolidation among the peasants and then land subdivision among their children has taken place. So, again, as usual, the Marxist view of things is a little simplistic. It lacks nuance. Unsurprising, that's true for a lot of Marxist thought. But yeah, you know, it's not totally wrong. An urban landowning class does emerge, but it just wasn't the dominant force until now. Until this rent offensive finally makes owning land and renting it out profitable. And so then you reach the final stage of the cycle. Around 1635, this great agricultural cycle, it reaches its terminal phase, the Depression. So we had the Depression. We started in the low water mark, right? We started in the low water mark with the Black Plague. We had the boom times. We had the stagnation. And now we have the final phase, the Depression. And is shocking. It really, really is shocking. Again, Ladurie provides statistical analysis. He looks at how prices change, how production changes, and everything just freaking collapses. Grain, wine, olive oil, livestock, there are cascading collapses in price and production. And again, a lot of these things depend on one another. Livestock in particular. When livestock collapses, something that people don't really think about, especially during this time period, when you're not raising as much livestock, you are not creating as much fertilizer. And that means that all of the plant crops suddenly become less productive because you don't have fertilizer for them. So that means that their production collapses, but at the same time, the wages are depressed. At the same time, nobody is really growing their businesses because, again, we're not in a capitalist society. So, like, prices are collapsing and production is collapsing at the same time. And by the late 1600s, farming has ceased to be profitable. The only profit to be found in Languedoc is this class of people who are owning the land, who are renting it out to these farmers who are perpetually in debt. They are perpetually up to their eyeballs in debt. They are robbing Peter to pay Paul every single day. They are getting paid less and less and less for the things that they produce. They're producing less and less as a result. It is absolutely a collapse, a depression of the highest order. And so naturally, as we've found pretty much throughout any society, when you have hard times, people stop having children, among other things. Because again, hard times also mean that people are starving. It means that, starving people are more susceptible to disease. So you start having outbreaks of disease again, and they become really, really bad during this time period. And of course, people stop having children because they can't feed them. So population peaks in Languedoc around 1670. It had been growing for the past 100 years. Like the boom time stopped in 1570. It kind of just grew sort of, just plodded along, maybe 1 or 2%, that sort of thing. Just a little bit of population growth. 1670, done, and it starts to fall. And Ladurie, again, does a really, really brilliant thing. He charts the population this time by showing the number of Easter communicants at the churches. It's like Easter was the big holiday. It's when everybody had to go to church, or was expected to go to church. You would get angry people showing up at your doorstep if you forgot to go to church on Easter. That's how seriously they took it. So the bishop, the archbishop of the area, was very interested in, making sure everybody is going to church for Easter at least. And so he counts. He has his underlings go around to every single church, and he has them ask the priest, okay, how many Easter communicants showed up? How many people are showing up here? It wasn't really the bishop's intention to track population. He wanted to make sure everybody was just showing up for Easter, but he keeps a record, and this record over time is perfect for showing how population changes, and it is very, very clear. Ladurie does the statistical analysis, and he creates a curve, and he shows that 1670 is the peak, and then it tapers off for about 100 years after that, even more in some places. And then we have the man on the right. We have the man on the right who gets involved. And one of the most hilarious things about this book is Louis XIV is usually considered to be a great man. He's considered to be, one of the most revolutionary, one of the most powerful kings. He should be feared, he should be respected, that sort of thing. He's a fascinating historical figure. In this book, Louis XIV is an asshole. A huge, huge asshole, a clueless asshole. And it's amazing. It's amazing, this take on him. It's one you don't see because it's the take of a peasant. It's the take of a peasant who is already suffering through this depression, and suddenly he gets slapped with the taxes for all of the wars that the glorious wars that Louis XIV is fighting and winning, really, really bringing France to the peak of its power. He's paying for it by taxing the peasants. This revolutionary bureaucracy that perfected absolutism, a political visionary. Who's paying for the bureaucracy? It's the peasants. And again, it's occurring during this depression period, so it's kind of hilarious. Louis XIV comes out of this book looking absolutely terrible. He looks like an idiot. He looks just so cruel, so tone deaf, has no idea what's going on. And yeah, these severe taxes that Louis XIV imposes on the peasants just make this entire situation so much worse. So it's kind of hilarious. And we're going to kind of talk about the, I think actually, is that it? Yeah, okay. So we're going to talk about that in just a little bit, kind of talking about the biases in the book. So, getting to the conclusion of actually talking about the book. The protagonist of Ladurie's work is a great agricultural cycle. So it's not the peasants so much And Ladurie says this himself. I'm quoting him. He calls the great agricultural cycle the protagonist of his book. And he traces it. It's the main character. It's what he's talking about throughout all of it. Its various effects on economy, social, society, culture, all that good stuff. He's tying it all to this great agricultural cycle with 4 stages. And we talked about them, right? It's the low water mark, the advance, the maturity, and then the collapse. And this very much echoes the works of Thomas Malthus, who was an early 18th century philosopher, and he kind of identified the same sort of thing going on in societies all over the world, even in animal populations. You have a low water mark. It's easy to get food. It's easy. The situation is right for rapid population growth, so that happens. It happens until you run up against the barrier, and the barrier is usually the number of mouths to feed. So you run into that barrier, and suddenly things mature. They stay at a certain level of maturity for a while, and then something goes wrong, and it collapses, and you get back to another low water mark. And this is the cycle. This is the cycle that really defined a lot of human history up until the Industrial Revolution. This is how pretty much every peasant society worked. It's stunning because it's true all over the world. Like, you look at China, they have these cycles. You look at like even some of the African bush people, they have these cycles where, maybe you have a few good years, and then you suddenly run into a drought. So you have a low water mark, people die off, and then you advance, and there's too many mouths to feed, or you have some sort of environmental thing go on, and then there's the collapse, and you go back to a low water mark. So it's just these constant 4 stages played out all throughout society. All throughout the world, in every single society. So it's very much Ladurie's work. What's the word I'm looking for? It very much confirms Malthus. It confirms these patterns that Malthus had identified 150 years ago. But interestingly enough, and Ladurie brings this up, the Industrial Revolution changes all of that, and it makes Malthus outdated. And it's the reason we have 8 billion people on the planet now, after staying, pretty stable at less than 1 billion for most of human history. It's why the Industrial Revolution occurs, and we suddenly have 8 billion people, because these sort of things that are acting on a peasant agricultural society, they suddenly become not relevant in the Industrial Revolution. Suddenly you have global trade. Suddenly, you don't have to cultivate grain in Languedoc. It's not a good place to cultivate grain, but you kind of have to because you're doing subsistence farming. But suddenly, you have these railroads. You have the ability to distribute goods over a wide area. You have these machines that allow you to do just a ridiculous amount of farming, to be incredibly productive, just one person on a tractor, So that means that not everybody has to farm. That means that Languedoc can do what it's actually good for, which is growing wine. And that's why Languedoc is an amazing wine growing region in France now, and hardly anybody grows grain anymore. But it was the opposite. It was the opposite before the industrial era. And so it's kind of very interesting. It's in a lot of ways, it's the last Malthusian cycle, because after the low water mark that occurs following the depression in the Peasants of Languedoc, you start to industrialize, and you break free of this. But yeah, it's very interesting. So it's kind of the Malthusian cycle that we have the best records on. It very, very much echoes the works of this guy on the left here. So, to sum up, the protagonist of the work is the great agricultural cycle, and it's kind of far from what Ladurie initially set out to do, right? He wanted to investigate the emergence of a capitalist class in early modern France, and ended up finding that the Marxist telling of history kind of lacked nuance, as I said, and that's true for a lot of Marxist thought. Not to be political about it. This is more just talking about the theory of Marxism. Not that quote-unquote Marxism has ever been tried. But yeah, just talking about the Marxist theory, it lacks nuance in a lot of stuff. And that's kind of Ladurie's conclusion as well. It's like, the Marxist assertion is that early modern France was defined by the emergence of an urban capitalist class that steadily aggregated land. And while that does sort of occur, it's not so simple, right? Because there's actually multiple cycles during this greater cycle of land aggregation and subdivision, right? You have the land aggregators in the 15th century after the plague. They're gentlemen farmers. They're peasants. They're not urban capitalists. The people building their big estates were not capitalists by any stretch of the imagination. And then after that occurs, there's a long period of land subdivision as those gentlemen farmers die off and they leave their estates to all of their numerous children. That's subdivision, not aggregation going on. And it's only with the rise of Calvinism, it's only at the very end, the maturity of this cycle, that you finally do see the emergence of these loan sharks and of this urban capitalist class. So, as usual, the Marxist telling of history lacks nuance, and that's kind of the thing that Ladurie ends up concluding out of his initial question. But the initial question is kind of not the main thing. It grew beyond that initial question, right, and became this work of total history, talking about just peasant society during this time period. So, that's the Peasants of Languedoc. That's sort of my book report on it. We're going to spend a little bit of time now on the other part of the title of this stream, because again, it's the Peasants of Languedoc and the Art of Writing History. So let's talk about why the Peasants of Languedoc was such an important book. So historiography is the magic word here. If you don't know this word, then this can be your word that you learn today. Talk about. So historiography, very, very simply, is the study of how history is written. It's sort of meta-history, right? It's the history of history. It's examining how people look at history, the things that they focus on, how certain cultures talk about certain historical events, what the differences are, what the biases are, that sort of thing. The type of historiography that Emmanuel Le Roy Ladurie did when he was researching the Peasants of Languedoc was pretty novel at the time. Because again, at this time, it was more about the narrative, right? It's about telling the story. It's about a biography of a king, right? You want to talk about all of the different things that happened in his life, the different things that he was responsible for, the battles he fought, the cities he founded, that sort of thing. And you do that with a narrative. You tell the story of his life. But this is not really what Ladurie is looking to do. He's looking not necessarily to tell a story, but to kind of paint a broader picture of what a society was actually like. And he uses very novel methods for this research. Usually when you're researching for a narrative, you look at primary sources, right? You look at the historians who were there and who are writing about it after it happens. And that's kind of how you construct a narrative. Maybe you do a little bit of, of archaeology, looking at some remnants of the past, be they, architecture or smaller items, that sort of thing. But you normally just build a narrative. Ladurie instead did statistical analysis. He looked at the hard data and he used that to paint a picture, and that was revolutionary at the time. Again, he published this in 1966. This was something that was not done very frequently before this. And so the Peasants of Languedoc, when it came out, it garnered a lot of fame. It became a very, very, very important, a very popular book in history. Because it was so different. It wasn't a narrative. He's not telling a story. He's really trying to put us in the shoes of a French peasant. He's trying to help us understand what that world was like. And he's using some very scientific means to do so, rather than just translating some historical accounts and kind of considering how they line up and how they differ and sort of coming up with a story. It's not really what Ladurie is doing. He's focusing almost exclusively on economic, social, and cultural history, which again were not very big things. I mean, it happened, but yeah. It was very, very novel for a book to focus almost entirely on these sorts of aspects of the society when it was published. And it was very novel that great men I was talking about Louis XIV a little while ago. Great men play very little role in the book, and when they do show up, it's generally talking about the effect that they had on the peasantry, right? There are some really, really crazy political and military things going on in France during this time period. Again, we talked about the wars of religion. We talked a little bit about the Huguenots, the huge struggle that occurred between them. It's epic. We talked about, Louis XIV and his reign and how he changed monarchy forever. That shows up very little in the Peasants of Languedoc, and when it does show up, like Louis XIV, it's in the context of the effect that he had on the peasants, which is why Louis XIV comes off looking so awful in the book, because, well, the main effect that he had on the peasants was raising taxes to pay for his wars and his bureaucracy, and this kind of kicked them while they were down, while their society was already in collapse. So great men play very, very little role in the Peasants of Languedoc, as you'd expect. I mean, it's a book about peasants. We're not talking about kings. We're not talking about generals. We're not talking about, we're not talking about these amazing political figures. We're talking about peasants. And so naturally, great men play very little role in the book, and that was a very, very novel concept when Ladurie published the book in 1966. And so, let's talk a little bit more about the school of thought, this influential school of thought, and that Ladurie is the one of the great exemplars for. It's called the Annales School. It's named after the Annales d'Histoire économique et sociale, which is the main historical journal in France, and it's dominated by this school of thought. There's actually 4 different waves of it. Ladurie is in the 3rd wave. The guy on the left is Lucien Febvre, who's one of the founders, the first wave of the Annales School. And it's extremely influential in 20th century French historiography. As I said, these people are absolutely obsessed with the early modern era in France, this time period that Ladurie is covering. This school is 100% obsessed with it. It's what they write about for the most part. So, not really sure why. I'd have to look into that, but it is the fact. They are extremely obsessed with the early modern era, and the Annales School becomes extremely influential in 20th century French historiography, which is again the way that history is written, and it has a huge impact on other countries as well. Latin America basically copies it, word for word, but it's very, very impactful on other countries as well, and eventually kind of takes over the world. The French historiography is kind of the first the canary in the coal mine, if you will. They're the first people to really do this. And this kind of history, we're going to talk about it a little more in a second, but this kind of history takes over the world. From the beginning, it stresses the use of social scientific methods in writing history and mainly focuses on social and economic themes. What a lead. I know, yeah, he's got the drip. He's got the drip going on, Febvre, for sure. It stresses social scientific methods in writing history, mainly focuses on social and economic themes. Again, it stresses kind of what Ladurie did. It's less about crafting a narrative, right? It's more about going in, actually looking at the hard data and seeing what it can tell us about the lives of the people that you are studying. These social scientific methods, the statistical analysis, looking at the geography and contemplating, what is the climate? What's the impact of the climate there? The geography, that sort of thing. So it's not hard science, but it's not completely soft science either, or at least it tries not to be. So Ladurie, as we said, led the 3rd wave of the school. The first wave was kind of around World War I. The second wave was World War II. Ladurie is the post-war period, and that's the 3rd wave. And the big focus of the 3rd wave is on mentalities, is what it's called. And again, it's an effort to understand the mindset of historical peoples in an almost anthropological sense. And before Ladurie, the big work was by a man named Bloch, and he wrote a book about the magic touch of the king. I forget. Oh God, what is the actual name of it? But he basically writes a book about this peasant belief that the touch of the king, like the king actually touching you, could cure diseases, like scrofula in particular. And this was a very common belief. It was very common all throughout Western Europe. It was in England, it was in France, it was in Germany to a certain extent, Spain. Uh, he doesn't necessarily look at whether that was true or not, but he studies it sort of like an anthropologist. He tries to figure out how extensive this belief was, why does this belief exist, who believes it, that sort of thing. So he approaches this belief like an anthropologist, and this is pretty much the biggest work of the second wave of the Annales school, and it's kind of what inspires Ladurie to develop this mentalities sort of thought. It's about understanding the mindset of the people that you are studying. It's not necessarily about building a narrative. It's not about relaying events as they happened in a chronicle. It's about understanding the mindset of, well, in the Peasants of Languedoc's case, it's about understanding the mindset and the life of a French peasant during the early modern era in this backwater of southern France. So Ladurie he's the leader of the third wave. There's actually a fourth wave that sort of rejects the mentalities concept, and this is the modern one. It's a reaction a little bit. They're more willing to do like political and military history to an extent. They're not so focused on social and economic themes anymore. So that's kind of the fourth wave. But we're talking about the third wave really, in this mentalities mindset. So that's the Annales school, and as I said, the Annales school becomes tremendously influential. So we're going to close out by talking a little bit about the actual discipline of history today and kind of the impact that the Annales school had. And a lot of it's laid out already if you're familiar with academic history at all nowadays. So the Annales school has been incredibly influential in how history is written. Social scientific analysis, that like what Ladurie did, it was very, very novel when he did it. It's extremely common today. Pretty much all, well, I don't want to say all, but a lot of actual serious academic history that's done today is very similar to what Ladurie is doing. It's about going into records. It's about looking at, it's about trying to find these primary sources, these tax records, these baptism records, these records of the tithe, that sort of thing. It's about collecting data points. It's about doing statistical analysis. It's about trying to paint a picture of a mindset, right? So the historical structure of a society is what historians today are more interested in than, that didn't come out right. So the historical structure of a society is more important than historical narrative to modern historians, right? They want to do the same thing that Ladurie did. They want to imitate him. They want to, in a lot of cases, help the modern reader understand the entire society, the mindset of the population that they're talking about, is generally the main goal of a historian today. A lot of times they're not as ambitious as Ladurie was. They're not necessarily wanting to do a total history, but, I'm going to examine the economic history of this region and how it shaped, history and the events that took place in this particular region, how it shaped the professions that people took and the attitudes they had towards foreigners and women and all that good stuff. Modern historians are more interested in understanding the mindset of a person in the past than they are in chronicling the event of the life of a great person. And that transitions very well into the next point. Great man history, quote unquote, about these kings, about these historically important figures. It is unfashionable in the academy today, but it still remains really, really popular with the general public, like biographies, military history, that sort of thing. Super, super popular with the general public, neglected nowadays in the academy because everybody is so interested. These quote-unquote serious historians, they usually want to focus on marginalized groups in history. So you want to talk about the peasants, you want to talk about the slaves, you want to talk about the women if they were oppressed, that sort of thing, and what their social, economic, cultural life was like, more than understanding the military history, the political goings on. These are kind of honestly kind of a little bit ignored today. And I think that's kind of a shame, to be quite honest. And that's why it when I was going to horse school, it seemed like a little bit of this was underway, and it kind of sounds like it's continuing. I probably need to look into this more seriously before I say this with any sort of certainty, but from what I've seen, from what I experienced, it seems like there's a reaction to the state of affairs going on, and that the new generation of historians, well shit, we talked about the fourth wave of the Annales School, the one after Ladurie, like, they kind of rebelled against this. They're willing to do political and military history now. They're willing to use a lot of the tools that they developed for that social history. They're willing to use it in other arenas now. They're willing to re-examine great men, and this is something that is also going on that's kind of a reaction as well. Like, for several, well, I don't want to say several, for about 2 generations, we were told, like, great man history bad. Like, you shouldn't, we know everything we need to know about the kings and the generals and that sort of thing, right? You don't need to waste your time looking into them. Everything that's been said about them has already been said. And, we have these, quite frankly, usually Marxist ideologies that simplify these people and say, oh, they're just capitalist pigs. Their function is just to keep people down, and that's all that you need to understand about them. The real action is understanding the plight of the proletariat. And if that sounds ridiculous to you, it's because it is. I'm enjoying this stream. I'm enjoying being able to kind of take the piss out of Marxism a little bit. It's not that well, I think it's over. I think I've said this several times. It lacks nuance, is my big problem with especially the Marxist view of history. It usually lacks nuance. It tries to assign very simple motivations. Again, like, all of the great men are just capitalist oppressors, and that's their function. We rule you, we fool you, so on and so forth. Blah. So Marxism paints in broad strokes, and that's just not the case in history. So yeah, there's a reaction to the state of affairs. There's a lot of serious scholarship being done now on military history, and there's a lot of biography going on as well. And a lot of it is about reimagining these great people, knowing what we know today, reimagining them in a different ideological lens, reimagining them based on, new evidence that has emerged, that sort of thing, that our modern techniques have done this statistical analysis and found that, hey, this guy who supposedly ruined his country's economy, well, the economy was actually doing pretty well during this time period. So what was he doing right? What was this great man doing right or doing wrong? So biography is coming back in a big way, and a lot of great men are being reassessed under all sorts of different ideological lenses. So there definitely is a reaction to this state of affairs going on, in my opinion. But again, I don't want to say anything too certain, because I need to research it more. I need to read more modern history, basically, is what I'm getting at. So I'll get to that. I'll get back to you with more of these history streams. So, man, I wasn't sure I was going to get an hour out of this. But that's it. That is it. Thank you so much for watching. So that was The Peasants of Languedoc and the Art of Writing History. I hope you enjoyed. I ate way too much pizza before this. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something. If you have any questions, anything you'd like me to go into more detail on, please do type into the chat. I'd love to answer some questions here at the end. But yeah, it is pretty wild. And I feel like when I went to horse school, I kind of got like the end of the current, or the modern history that I was sort of talking about there at the end. I kind of got like the worst, the most degenerate version of that. It's like it's like a cycle. Do you have any great man reimagined biography? Ooh, that is a really cool. That is a really cool question. Putting me on the spot now. There is. Oh, actually. And this is one I probably want to do a history presentation about. Have you heard of the Dowager Empress Cixi? She was kind of the she was basically the Empress of China throughout a lot of the 19th century. Um, and she is absolutely, like in communist Chinese historiography, she is the devil, as you might expect, and she was definitely not like she's not blameless at all. Like obviously, the 19th century was the century of humiliations for China, and she kind of oversaw a lot of it. There is a great biography. Oh God, who was the author? But there's a great biography kind of looking at her, and there's actually been a few. Uh, yeah, looking at her and kind of reassessing her role and kind of getting away from the communist Chinese historiography a little bit, and really. It doesn't present her in a totally positive light, but it does give her credit for what she tried to do, and she does deserve a little bit of credit. She was put in just a god awful situation, and she did try to make some industrialization, some reforms, but she was just in an impossible situation, obviously. So yeah, kind of it's a more sympathetic reimagining of the Dowager Empress Cixi, and I can let me type that into chat. And actually, let me pull up. Let me see if I can find the book. Because it was a really cool book. Yes, this is the one. Okay. It is... Yes. So it's called The Concubine Who Launched Modern China, Empress Dowager Cixi. It's by Young Chang. So let me put that into chat. Yeah. So that's a cool book. That's one I read kind of recently, and I really enjoyed. Yeah, and it's obviously, as the title kind of implies, it's a far more sympathetic view on the Empress Dowager Cixi, the concubine who launched modern China, and she has a very, very cool life story in general. Yeah, just well, as the title implies, right? She starts as one of the emperor's concubine and gets lucky enough to have his first kid. And then the emperor promptly dies, so her kid becomes the emperor at like age 5, and she does these crazy political maneuvers and basically becomes the real ruler of China. And her son, probably in part due to her prodding, and she kind of engineers it that way, her son becomes a gigantic man-child, so she clings to power, and then her son dies really young, so she has like this great nephew who's also like 2 years old when he gets put on the throne, so she continues to cling to power during that time until her nephew finally grows up. Her nephew's a little bit more willful, so it's quite likely that she poisons him, but she does so on her deathbed. So like she dies. I can't remember the order. Like she and her nephew both die within like a couple days of each other, and it's generally believed that she poisoned him. Because he was trying to finally put on the big boy pants and become the real emperor of China, and this rapidly leads to the collapse of the Qing dynasty. So yeah, she's a really, really cool figure, and I really like that biography. It's not a serious scholarly work. It is a work of pop history for sure, and. I mean, you saw me putting the quotations around serious historians, right? And I think that is another big thing that's changing in history today. Is the Academy is losing a lot of its weight, right? I think there are some history channels on YouTube. There are some quote-unquote pop history writers who have better ideas, who have a lot more vitality, who frankly do better history than a lot of this serious academic history. And if you want my opinion on it, it's I think it's a little short-sighted. Like this academic history is how to put it? Short-sighted is a good word for it, actually. Short-sighted is a good word for it, I think, because they're focusing, and I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing all the time. Like the Peasants of Languedoc is a fantastic book, but it does start this trend of sort of focusing on these marginalized people, and there's nothing wrong with that. They should have their stories told as well. But yeah, I think the great man history has suffered a little bit as a result. And so I'm kind of pleased to see these biographies kind of cropping up and reimagining or reassessing a lot of historical figures. I'm really, really pleased to see the serious scholarship that's going into military history nowadays. Like there was always an undercurrent of it, but I think it's a lot more popular now, like since 2000. It's really been revitalized. So I'm happy to see that as well. Military history is one of my favorites. And I don't think you necessarily need to be doing history for a prestigious academic institution to do good history, frankly. Obviously, I wouldn't be doing this channel if I didn't believe that. So yeah, I think that is part of the revolution in history as well. The democratization of history, if you will, is a big thing that is changing, and I think that's the real groundswell that's going to have a real effect going forward into the future. But yeah, definitely. I'm thinking about maybe doing a presentation about the Dowager Empress Sushi. It is on my list. It is on my list of ideas. So yeah, if it sounds interesting to you, I'll definitely consider doing that one here pretty soon. Because yeah, she's absolutely fascinating. So yeah, that was a good one. Actually, the biography of Caligula that I used as the primary source for my first history presentation, that was Aloy Winterling, I think. Yeah, yes, it's just called Caligula, a biography by Aloy Winterling. That was another really good one. And yeah, as I said, I'll type this into chat here. And that's a really cool one, and it reassesses, and I mean, I talked about this in the presentation as well. It kind of reassesses this idea that Caligula was insane, and kind of paints a lot of what he was doing in a more reasonable light, paints it in this narrative as, his conflict with the Roman aristocracy. And a lot of the seemingly insane stuff he does is just this, frankly, just this master troll who's given unlimited power and decides to troll the crap out of the aristocrats, which is why I love Caligula Sensei so much. So yeah, that's another one I can definitely recommend if you hadn't checked it out. And ignore my message. It's a Caligula biography. I forgot the Y. But yeah, Aloy's Winterling is I think it's just Aloy Winterling. Yeah, that's another great one, and it's another sort of re-examination of a historical figure. So yeah, that's another cool one. Anybody have any other questions, maybe about the presentation? Let's see. I'm trying to think if there's anything I missed, anything else I want to talk about. While we're waiting, it is. I know. I'm kind of surprised Sal is here, because I know he's probably getting ready for the for the big day. It is it's the first day of the sumo tournament. So check that out if you can. I think it's going to be a fascinating one. Yeah, the sumo tournament is going on in Tokyo. It is in Tokyo right now, yeah? Yeah, because the last one was in Fukuoka. Yeah. So, yep, first day of the sumo tournament is occurring. So, probably going to be watching that after, it's not for a few more hours, but that's what I'm doing tonight, is watching the sumo tournament. So, worth checking that out. I've thought about... I would need to learn a lot more about sumo before I talked about it on YouTube, but I think it would be interesting to talk about that. Maybe I could bring Sal on as a guest, so he would actually know what the hell he's talking about. All right. Well, it doesn't look like there are any more questions. If you're typing one out, maybe just like real quick in chat, tell me that you're working on something, and I'll stick around. But other than that, I'm probably going to go ahead and bring it to a close. So again, thank you so much for stopping by. Thanks so much for your patience with me. Yeah. Winter's hard. Winter is just hard. I think it's called like seasonal affective disorder or some shit like that. I don't want to be one of those people who self-diagnoses or anything, but yeah, winter's hard for me. So thank you so much for your patience. I'm glad I finally got this done. There will be much less of a lag between this one and the next history stream. I want to, that is one of my big New Year's resolutions, is to get a lot more consistent with these history streams. So gonna work on getting the next one out pretty quick. And hell, I'll probably start the research for it this week. So again, thank you so very much for your patience. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you learned something most of all. And yeah, I will see you around later. I'm definitely going to be doing a stream tomorrow. Might be going back to Graveyard Keeper, I think. We'll do the old standbys, and then we'll maybe get into some new stuff in the coming week. So yeah, probably going to do a Graveyard Keeper stream tomorrow night, and then take Monday off and get right back onto that grind. So thank you all so very much for watching again. I can never say thank you enough. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Doesn't look like there's any more questions in the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and bring it to a close. Until next time, Amiki, I must bid you wale. Please take very good care of yourself, and I will see you again tomorrow. Assuming you're watching this live. If you're watching the VOD, thank you so much for checking it out. Until next time, see you later. Bye-bye. Later, peasants. Wale. Yes, wale, Missy. Thanks so much for stopping by. Alright, later, dudes.